Chapter 11. Gone. I wonder if many married couples are quite as happy as we found ourselves. Cynics, a growing class, declare that few illusions can survive a honeymoon. Well, I do not know about it, for I only married once, and I can speak from my limited experience. But certainly our illusion, or rather the great truth of which it is the shadow, did survive. As to this day, it survives in my heart across all the years of utter separation, and across the unanswering gulf of gloom. But complete happiness is not allowed in this world, even for an hour, as our marriage day had been shadowed by the scene which has been described, so our married life was shadowed by its own sorrow. 3 days after our wedding, Mr. Carson had a stroke. It had been long impending. Now it fell. We came into the center hut to dinner and found him lying speechless on the couch. At first, I thought that he was dying, but this was not so. On the contrary, within 4 hours or within 4 days, he recovered his speech and some power of movement. But he never recovered his memory, though he still knew Stella and sometimes myself. Curiously enough, he remembered little Tota best of all three, though occasionally he thought that she was his own daughter in her childhood and would ask her where her mother was. This state of affairs lasted for some 7 months. The old man gradually grew weaker, but he did not die. Of course, his condition quite precluded the idea of our leaving Babian Kraal till all was over. This was the more distressing to me because I had a nervous presentiment that Stella was incurring danger by staying there, and also because the state of her health rendered it desirable that we should reach a civilized region as soon as possible. However, it could not be helped. At length, the end came very suddenly. We were sitting one evening by Mr. Carson's bedside in his hut, when to our astonishment he sat up and spoke in a strong, full voice. "I hear you," he said. "Yes, yes, I forgive you. Poor woman, you too have suffered," and he fell back dead. I have little doubt that he was addressing his lost wife, some vision of whom had flashed across his dying sense. Stella, of course, was overwhelmed with grief at her loss. Till I came, her father had been her sole companion, and therefore, as may be imagined, the tie between them was much closer than is usual, even in the case of father and daughter. So deeply did she mourn that I began to fear for the effect upon her health. Nor were we the only ones to grieve. All the natives on the settlement called Mr. Carson father, and as a father they lamented him. The air resounded with the wailing of women, and the men went about with bowed heads, saying that the sun had set in the heavens, now only the star, Stella, remained. Indiba Zambi alone did not mourn. He said that it was best that the Inkus should die, for what was life worth when one lay like a log? Moreover, that it would have been well for all if he had died sooner. On the following day, we buried him in the little graveyard near the waterfall. It was a sad business, and Stella cried very much, in spite of all I could do to comfort her. That night, as I sat outside the hut smoking, for the weather was hot and Stella was lying down inside, old Indabazimbi came up, saluted, and squatted at my feet. "What is it, Indabazimbi?" I said. "This, Macumazahn. When are you going to trek towards the coast?" "I don't know," I answered. "The star is not fit to travel now. We must wait a while." "No, Macumazahn. You must not wait. You must go, and the star must take her chance. She is strong. It is nothing. All will be well." "Why do you say so? Why must we go?" For this reason, Macumazahn, and he looked cautiously round and spoke low, the baboons have come back in thousands. All the mountain is full of them. I did not know that they had gone. I said, yes, he answered. They went after the marriage, all but one or two. Now they are back. All the baboons in the world, I think. I saw a whole cliff back with them. Is that all? I said, for I saw that he had something behind. I'm not afraid of a pack of baboons. No, Macumazahn, it is not all. The Babian Frau Hendrika is with them. Now nothing had been heard or seen of Hendrika since her expulsion, and though at first she and her threats had haunted me somewhat, by degrees she to a great extent had passed out of my mind, which was fully preoccupied with Stella and my father-in-law's illness. I started violently. How do you know this? I asked. I know it because I saw her, Macumazahn. She's disguised. She's dressed up in baboon skins, and her face is stained dark. But though she was a long way off, I knew her by her size, and I saw the white flesh of her arm when the skin slipped aside. She has come back, Macumazahn, with all the baboons in the world, and she has come back to do evil. Now, do you understand why you should trek? Yes, I said, though I don't see how she and the baboons can harm us. I think that it will be better to go. If necessary, we can camp the wagons somewhere for a while on the journey. Hearken, Indabazimbi, say nothing of this to the star. I'll not have her frightened. And hearken again. Speak to the headmen and see that watchers are set all around the huts and gardens and kept there night and day. Tomorrow we will go the wagons ready, and next day we will trek. He nodded his white lock and went to do my bidding, leaving me not a little disturbed, unreasonably so, indeed. It was a strange story that this woman had the power of conversing with baboons. I knew that was not so very wonderful, seeing that the Bushmen claimed to be able to do the same thing, and she had been nurtured by them, but that she had been able to master them, and by the strength of her human will and intelligence master them in order to forward her ends of revenge, seemed to me so incredible that after reflection my fears grew light. Still I determined to trek. After all, a journey in an ox wagon would not be such a very terrible thing to a strong woman accustomed to roughing it, whatever her state of health. And when all was said and done, I did not like this tale of the presence of Hendrika with countless hosts of baboons. So I went in to Stella, and without saying a word to her of the baboon story, told her I had been thinking matters over and had come to the conclusion that it was our duty to follow her father's instructions to the letter and leave Babian Kraals at once. Into all our talk I need not enter, but the end of it was that she agreed with me and declared that she could quite well manage the journey, saying moreover that now that her dear father was dead she would be glad to get away. Nothing happened to disturb us that night, and on the following morning I was up early making preparations. The despair of the people when they learned that we were going to leave them was something quite pitiable. I could only console them by declaring that we were but on a journey and would return the following year. They had lived in the shadow of their father, who was dead, they declared. Ever since they were little, they had lived in his shadow. He had received them when they were outcasts and wanderers, without a mat to lie on or a blanket to cover them, and they had grown fat in his shadow. Then he had died, and the star, their father's daughter, had married me, Macumazahn, and they had believed that I should take their father's place and let them live in my shadow. What should they do when there was no one to protect them? The tribes were kept from attacking them by fear of the white man. If we went, they would be eaten up, and so on. Alas, there was but too much foundation for their fears. I returned to the huts at midday to get some dinner. Stella said that she was going to pack during the afternoon, so I did not think it necessary to caution her about going out alone, as I did not wish to allude to the subject of Hendrika and the baboons unless I was obliged to. I told her, however, that I would come back to help her as soon as I could get away. Then I went down to the native kraals to sort out such cattle as had belonged to Mr. Carson from those which belonged to the Kaffirs, for I proposed to take them with us. It was a large herd, and the business took an incredible time. At length, a little before sundown, I gave it up, and leaving Indabazimbi to finish the job, got on my horse and rode homewards. Arriving, I gave the horse to one of the stable boys and went into the central hut. There was no sign of Stella, though the things she had been packing lay about the floor. I passed first into our sleeping hut, thence one by one into all the others, but still saw no sign of her. Then I went out and, calling to a Kaffir in the garden, asked him if he had seen his mistress. He answered yes, he had seen her carrying flowers and walking towards the graveyard, holding the little white girl, my daughter, as he called her, by the hand. When the sun stood there, and he pointed to a spot on the horizon where it would have been about an hour and a half before. The two dogs were with them, he added. I turned and ran towards the graveyard, which was about a quarter of a mile from the huts. Of course, there was no reason to be anxious. Evidently, she had gone to lay the flowers on her father's grave, and yet I was anxious. When I got near the graveyard, I met one of the natives, who, by my orders, had been set round the kraals to watch the place, and noticed that he was rubbing his eyes and yawning. Clearly, he had been asleep. I asked him if he had seen his mistress, and he answered that he has not, which under the circumstances was not wonderful. Without stopping to reproach him, I ordered the man to follow me, and went on to the graveyard. There, on Mr. Carson's grave, lay the drooping flowers which Stella had been carrying, and there in the fresh mould was the poor of Tota's veldschoen, or hide slipper. But where were they? I ran from the graveyard and called aloud at the top of my voice, but no answer came. Meanwhile, the native was more profitably engaged in tracing their spoor. He followed it for about 100 yards till he came to a clump of mimosa bush that was situated between the stream and the ancient marble quarries just over the waterfall, and at the mouth of the ravine. Here he stopped, and I heard him give a startled cry. I rushed to the spot, passed through the trees, and saw this. The little open space in the center of the glade had been the scene of a struggle. There, in the soft earth, were the marks of 3 pairs of human feet, 2 shod, 1 naked, Stella's, Tota's, and Hendrika's. Nor was this all. There, close by, lay the fragments of 2 dogs. They were nothing more, and 1 baboon, not yet quite dead, which had been bitten in the throat by the dogs. All around was the spoor of numberless baboons. The full horror of what had happened flashed into my mind. My wife and Tota had been carried off by the baboons. As yet they had not been killed, for if so, their remains would have been found with those of the dogs. They had been carried off. The brutes, acting under the direction of that woman monkey, Hendrika, had dragged them away to some secret den, there to keep them till they died, or killed them. For a moment, I literally staggered beneath the terror of the shock. Then I roused myself from my despair. I bade the native run and alarm the people at the kraals, telling them to come armed and bring me guns and ammunition. He went like the wind, and I turned to follow the spoor. For a few yards it was plain enough. Stella had been dragged along. I could see where her heels had struck the ground. The child had, I presumed, been carried. At least there were no marks of her feet. At the water's edge the spoor vanished. The water was shallow, and they had gone along in it. or at least Hendrika had her victim had in order to obliterate the trail. I could see where a moss-grown stone had been freshly turned over in the waterbed. I ran along the bank some way up the ravine in the vain hope of catching a sight of them. Presently, I heard a bark in the cliffs above me. It was answered by another, and then I saw the scores of baboons were hidden about among the rocks on either side, and were softly swinging themselves down to bar the path. To go on unarmed as I was would be useless. I should only be torn to pieces as the dogs had been, so I turned and fled back towards the huts. As I drew near, I could see that my messenger had roused the settlement, for natives with spears and carries in their hands were running up towards the kraals. When I reached the hut, I met old Indaba-zimbi, who wore a very serious face. "So the evil has fallen, Macumazahn," he said. "It has fallen," I answered. "Keep a good heart, Macumazahn," he said again. "She's not dead, nor is the little maid, and before they die, we shall find them. Remember this, Hendrika loves her. She will not harm her, or allow the Babians to harm her. She will try to hide her away from you, that is all. Pray God that we may find her." I groaned. "The light is going fast." "The moon rises in 3 hours," he answered. "We will search by moonlight. It is useless to start now. See, the sun sinks. Let us get the men together, eat, and make things ready. Hamba Gachla, hasten slowly, Macumazahn." As there was no help, I took his advice. I could eat no food, but I patched some up to take with us, and made ready ropes and a rough kind of litter. If we found them, they would scarcely be able to walk. Ah, if we found them! How slowly the time passed! It seemed hours before the moon rose, but at last it did rise. Then we started. In all we were about 100 men, but we only mustered 5 guns between us, my elephant roer, and 4 that had belonged to Mr. Carson. Chapter 12. The Magic of Indaba-zimbi. We gained the spot by the stream where Stella had been taken. The natives looked at the torn fragments of the dogs and at the marks of violence, and I heard them swearing to each other that whether the star lived or died, they would not rest till they had exterminated every baboon on Babian's Peak. I echoed the oath, and as shall be seen, we kept it. We started on along the stream, following the spoor of the baboons as we best could. But the stream left no spoor, and the herd, rocky banks, very little. Still we wandered on. All night we wandered through the lonely moonlit valleys, starting the silence into 1,000 echoes with our cries, but no answer came to them. In vain our eyes searched the sides of precious formed of water-riven rocks, fantastically piled one upon another. In vain we searched through endless dells and fern-clad crannies. There was nothing to be found. How could we expect to find 2 human beings hidden away in the recesses of this vast stretch of mountain ground, which no man yet had ever fully explored? They were lost, and in all human probability lost forever. To and fro, where we wandered hopelessly, till at last dawn found us footsore and weary nearly at the spot whence we had started. We sat down waiting for the sun to rise, and the men ate of such food as they had brought with them, and sent to the kraals for more. I sat upon a stone with a breaking heart. I cannot describe my feelings. Let the reader put himself in my position, and perhaps he may get some idea of them. Near me was old Indaba-zimbi, who sat staring straight before him as though he were looking into space, and taking note of what went on there. An idea struck me. This man has some occult power. Several times during our adventures he had prophesied, and in every case his prophecies had proved true. He It was who, when we escaped from Zulu Impi, had told me to steer north because there we should find the place of a white man who lived under the shadow of a great peak that was full of baboons. Perhaps he could help in this extremity. At any rate, it was worth trying. Indaba Zimbi, I said, you say that you can send your spirit through the doors of space and see what we cannot see. At the least, I know that you can do strange things. Can you not help me now? If you can and will save her, I'll give you half the cattle that we have here. I never said anything of the sort, Macumazahn, he answered. I do things, I do not talk about them. Neither do I seek reward for what I do like a common witch doctor. It is well that you have asked me to use my wisdom, Macumazahn, for I should not have used it again without being asked. No, not even for the sake of the star and yourself, whom I love. For if so, my spirit would have been angry. In the other matters, I had a part, for my life was concerned as well as yours. But in this matter, I have no part, and therefore I might not use my wisdom unless you thought well to call upon my spirit. However, it would have been not good to ask me before, for I have only just found the herb I want. And he produced a handful of the leaves of a plant that was unfamiliar to me. If I had prickly leaves, shaped very much like those of the common English nettle. No, Macumazahn, he went on, bid the men leave us alone and then follow me presently to the little glade down there by the water. I did so. When I reached the glade, I found Indaba Zimbi's kindling a small fire under the shadow of a tree by the edge of the water. Sit there, Macumazahn, he said, pointing to a stone near the fire, and do not be surprised or frightened at anything you see. If you move or call out, we shall learn nothing. I sat down and watched. When the fire was alight and burning brightly, the old fellow stripped himself stark naked, and going to the foot of the pool, dipped himself in the water. Then he came back shivering with the cold, and leaning over the little fire, thrust leaves of the plant I have mentioned into his mouth, and began to chew them, muttering as he chewed. Most of the remaining leaves he threw onto the fire. A dense smoke rose from them, but he held his head in this smoke and drew it down his lungs till I saw that he was exhibiting every sign of suffocating. The veins in his throat and chest swelled. He gasped loudly, and his eyes, from which tears were streaming, seemed as though they were going to start from his head. Presently he fell over on his side and lay senseless. I was terribly alarmed, and my first impulse was to run to his assistance. But fortunately I remembered his caution and sat quiet. Indaba Zimbi lay on the ground like a person quite dead. His limbs had all the utter relaxation of death, but as I watched, I saw them begin to stiffen, exactly as though rigor mortis had set in. Then, to my astonishment, I perceived them once more relax, and this time there appeared upon his chest the stain of decomposition. It spread and spread. In 3 minutes the man, to all appearance, was a livid corpse. I sat amazed, watching this uncanny sight, and wondering if any further natural process was about to be enacted. Perhaps Indaba Zimbi was going to fall to dust before my eyes. As I watched, I observed that the discoloration was beginning to fade. First it vanished from the extremities, then from the larger limbs, and lastly from the trunk. Then in turn came the third stage of relaxation, the second stage of stiffness or rigor, and the first stage of after-death collapse. When all these had rapidly succeeded each other, Indaba Zimbi quietly woke up. I was too astonished to speak. I simply looked at him with my mouth open. Well, Macumazahn, he said, putting his head on one side like a bird and nodding his white lock in a comical fashion. It is all right, I have seen her. Seen who? I said. The star, your wife, and the little maid. They are much frightened but unharmed. The Babian Frau watches them. She is mad, but the baboons obey her and do not hurt them. The star was sleeping from weariness, so I whispered in her ear and told her not to be frightened, for you would soon rescue her, and that meanwhile she must seem to be pleased to have Henrika near her. You whispered in her ear? I said. How could you whisper in her ear? Bah, Macumazahn, how could I seem to die and go rotten before your eyes? You don't know, do you? Well, I'll tell you one thing. I had to die to pass the doors of space, as you call them. I had to draw all the healthy strength and life from my body in order to gather power to speak with the star. It was a dangerous business, Macumazahn, for if I had let things go a little further, they must have stopped so, and there would have been an end of Indaba Zimbi. Ah, you white man, you know so much that you think you know everything, but you don't. You are always starting at the clouds and can't see the things that lie at your feet. You hardly believe me now, do you, Macumazahn? Well, I'll show you. Have you anything on you that the star has touched or worn? I thought for a moment and said that I had a lock for her of her hair in my pocketbook. He told me to give it to him. I did so. Going to the fire, he lit the lock of hair in the flame and let it burn to ashes, which he caught in his left hand. These ashes he mixed up in a paste with the juice of one of the leaves of the plant I have spoken of. Now, Macumazahn, shut your eyes, he said. I did so, and he rubbed his paste onto my eyelids. At first it burned me, then my head swam strangely. Presently this effect passed off, and my brain was perfectly clear again. But I could not feel the ground with my feet. Indaba Zimbi led me to the side of the stream. Beneath us was a pool of beautifully clear water. Look into the pool, Macumazahn, said Indaba Zimbi, and his voice sounded hollow and far away in my ears. I looked. The water grew dark. It cleared, and in it was a picture. I saw a cave with a fire burning in it. Against the wall of the cave rested Stella. Her dress was torn almost off her. She looked dreadfully pale and weary, and her eyelids were red as though with weeping. But she slept, and I could almost think that I saw her lips shape my name in her sleep. Close to her, her head upon Stella's breast, was little Tota. She had a skin thrown over her to keep out the night cold. The child was awake and appeared to be moaning with fear. By the fire, and in such a position that the light fell full upon her face, and engaged in cooking something in a rough pot shaped from wood, sat the baboon woman, Hendrika. She was clothed in baboon skins, and her face had been rubbed with some dark stain, which was, however, wearing off it. In the intervals of her cooking she would turn on Stella her wild eyes, in which glared visible madness, with an expression of tenderness that amounted to worship. Then she would stare at the child and gnash her teeth as though with hate. Clearly she was jealous of it. Round the entrance arch of the cave peeped and peered the heads of many baboons. Presently Hendrika made a sign to one of them. Apparently she did not speak, or rather grunt, in order not to wake Stella. The brute hopped forward, and she gave it a second rude wooden pot which was lying by her. It took it and went. The last thing that I saw as the vision slowly vanished from the pool was the dim shadow of the baboon returning with the pot full of water. Presently everything had gone. I ceased to feel strange. There beneath me was the pool, and at by my side stood Indaba Zimbi smiling. You have seen things, he said. I have, I answered, and made no further remark on the matter. What was there to say? Do you know the path to the cave? I added. He nodded his head. I did not follow it all just now because it winds, he said. But I know it. We shall want the ropes. Then let us be starting. The men have eaten. He nodded his head again, and going to the men, I told them to make ready, adding that Indabazimbi knew the way. They said that was all right if Indabazimbi had smelled her out. They should soon find the star. So we started cheerfully enough, and my spirits were so much improved that I was able to eat a boiled mealy cob or two as we walked. We went up the valley, following the course of the stream for about a mile. Then Indabazimbi made a sudden turn to the right, along another kloof of which there were countless numbers in the base of the great hill. On we went through kloof after kloof. Indabazimbi, who led us, was never at a loss. He turned up gullies and struck across necks of hills with the certainty of the hound on a hot scent. At length, after about 3 hours' march, we came to a big silent valley on the Morben slope at the great peak. On one side of this valley was a series of stony kopjes. On the other rose a sheer wall of rock. We marched along the wall for a distance of some 2 miles. Then suddenly Ndabazimbi halted. "There is the place," he said, pointing to an opening in the cliff. This opening was about 40 feet from the ground, and ellipse-shaped. It cannot have been more than 20 feet high by 10 wide, and was partially hidden by ferns and bushes that grew about in the surface of the cliff. Keen as my eyes were, I doubted if I should ever have noticed it, for there were many such cracks and crannies in the rocky face of the great mountain. We drew near and looked carefully at the place. The first thing I noticed was that the rock, which was not quite perpendicular, had been worn by the continual passage of baboons. The second, that something white was hanging on a bush near the top of the ascent. It was a pocket handkerchief. Now there was no more doubt about the matter. With a beating heart, I began the ascent. For the first 20 feet, it was comparatively easy, for the rock shelved. The next 10 feet was very difficult, but still possible to an active man, and I achieved it, followed by Ndabazimbi. But the last 12 or 15 feet could only be scaled by throwing a rope over the trunk of a stunted tree, which grew at the bottom of the opening. This we accomplished with some trouble, and the rest was easy. A foot or two above my head, the handkerchief fluttered in the wind. Hanging to the rope, I grasped it. It was my wife's. As I did so, I noticed the face of a baboon peering at me over the edge of the cleft. The first baboon we had seen that morning. The brute gave a bark and vanished. Thrusting the handkerchief into my breast, I set my feet against the cliff and scrambled up as hard as I could go. I knew that we had no time to lose, for the baboon would quickly alarm the others. I gained the cleft. It was a mere arched passage cut by water, ending in a gully, which led to a wide open space of some sort. I looked through the passage and saw that the gully was black with baboons. On they came by the hundreds. I unslung my elephant gun from my shoulders and waited, calling to the men below to come up with all possible speed. The brutes streamed on down the gloomy gulf towards me, barking, grunting, and showering their hung teeth. I waited till they were within 15 yards, then I fired the elephant gun, which was loaded with slugs, right into the thick of them. In that narrow place, the report echoed like a cannon shot, but its sound was quickly swallowed in the volley of piercing, human-sounding groans and screams that followed. The charge of heavy slugs had ploughed through the host of baboons. of which at least a dozen lay dead or dying in the passage. For a moment they hesitated, then they came on again with a hideous clamor. Fortunately, by this time, Indabazimbi, who also had a gun, was standing by my side, otherwise I should have been torn to pieces before I could reload. He fired both barrels into them and again checked the rush, but they came on again, and notwithstanding the appearance of two other natives with guns, which they let off with more or less success, we should have been overwhelmed by the great and furious apes, and I not by this time succeeded in reloading the elephant gun. When they were right on us, I fired with more deadly effect than before, for at the distance every slug told on their long line. The howls and screams of pain and rage were now something inconceivable. One might have thought that they were doing battle with a host of demons. Indeed, in that light, for the overhanging arc of rock made it very dark. The garnishing snorts and somber, glowing eyes of the apes looked like those of devils, as they are represented by monkish fancy. But the last shot was too much for them. They withdrew, dragging some of their wounded with them, and thus gave us time to get our men up the cliff. In a few minutes all were there, and we advanced down the passage, which presently opened into a rocky gully with shelving sides. This gully had a waterway at the bottom of it. It was about 100 yards long, and the slopes on either side were topped by precipitous cliffs. I looked at these slopes. They literally swarmed with baboons, grunting, barking, screaming, and beating their breasts with their long arms. In fury, I looked up the waterway. Along it, accompanied by a mob, or as it were, a guard of baboons, ran Hendrika, her long hair flying, madness written on her face, and in her arms was the senseless form of little Tota. She saw us, and a foam of rage burst from her lips. She screamed loud. To me, the sound was a mere inarticulated cry, but the baboons clearly understood it, for they began to roll rocks down onto us. One boulder leaped past me and struck down a Kaffir behind. Another fell from the roof of the ark onto a man's head and killed him. Indabazimbi lifted his gun to shoot Hendrika. I knocked it up, so that the shot went over her, crying that he would kill the child. Then I shouted to the men to open out and form a line from side to side of the shelving gully. Furious at the loss of their two comrades, they obeyed me, and keeping in the waterway myself, together with Indabazimbi and the other guns, I gave the word to charge. Then the real battle began. It is difficult to say who fought the most fiercely, the natives or the baboons. The Kaffirs charged along the slopes, and as they came, encouraged by the screams of Hendrika, who rushed to and fro holding the wretched Tota before her as a shield, the apes bounded at them in fury. Scores were killed by the assegais, and many more fell beneath our gunshots. But still they came on, nor did we go scathless. Occasionally, a man would slip or be pulled over in the grip of a baboon. Then the others would fling themselves upon him like dogs on a rat and worry him to death. We lost 5 men in this way, and I myself received a bite through the fleshy part of the left arm. But fortunately, a native near me gained the animal before I was pulled down. At length, and all of a sudden, the baboons gave up. A panic seemed to seize them. Notwithstanding the cries of Hendrika, they thought no more of fight, but only of escape. Some even did not attempt to get away from the assegai of the Kaffirs. They simply hid their horrible faces in their paws and moaned piteously, waited to be slain. Enrica saw that the battle was lost. Dropping the child from her arms, she rushed straight at us, a very picture of horrible insanity. I lifted my gun, but could not bear to shoot. After all, she was but a mad thing, half ape, half woman. So I sprang to one side, and she landed full on Indaba-zimbi, knocking him down. But she did not stay to do any more. Wailing terribly, she rushed down the gully and through the ark, followed by a few of the surviving baboons, and vanished from our sight.